The women of Timber Ridge had opinions about everything, but nothing got their tongues wagging quite like the news that Jacob Thornwood was looking for a wife. They gathered in clusters outside the general store, their voices dropping to scandalized whispers whenever someone new walked by. Mrs. Henderson clutched her shopping basket tighter and declared she'd rather sleep in the street than marry that man. Her friend nodded so vigorously her bonnet nearly slipped off. Jacob wasn't cruel. He'd never raised his voice to anyone or caused trouble in town. But he was different, and different scared people. Standing well over 6 feet tall with shoulders that seemed to fill doorways, he had the kind of presence that made folks step aside without thinking. His beard grew wild and untamed, and his hands looked like they could snap wood without effort. Maybe that's why people avoided him. Or maybe it was because he lived alone up in those mountains, showing his face in town only twice a year when he needed supplies. Nobody really knew Jacob. That was the problem. He'd arrive in his worn wagon, conduct his business in near silence, and disappear back into the wilderness. People filled that silence with their own stories. Some said he was running from the law. Others whispered he'd gone half wild living alone up there. The truth was simpler and sadder than any of their tales, but nobody bothered to ask. His mother had been sick for months down in the valley. In her final days, she'd held his rough hand in her frail one and made him promise something. She didn't want him to die alone up there in those mountains. She wanted him to find someone, anyone, to share his life with, a companion who might understand him. Jacob had tried to tell her he was fine, that he preferred the quiet, but she'd squeezed his hand with surprising strength. A mother's last wish carries weight, so here he was, awkwardly letting it be known he was looking for a wife. Clara Whitmore heard every word of the gossip. She stood near the back corner of the store, pretending to examine a display of ribbons she couldn't afford. At 23, she should have been married already. That's what everyone thought. But her father had drunk and gambled away everything before dying and leaving them with debts that kept growing. Her stepmother reminded her of this daily, along with the fact that she had exactly 1 month to find a husband or get out. The house would go to the bank soon. Her 2 younger half-sisters would end up in the orphanage if something didn't change. Her stepmother had made it crystal clear that Clara was the problem and the solution. Find a man with money, marry him, and fix this mess. Or leave and take her bad luck with her. Clara's hands shook as she touched the ribbons. She wasn't thinking about the mountain man because she wanted to. She was thinking about him because she was desperate, and desperate people consider options they'd normally never touch. The women's voices carried clearly to where she stood. Can you imagine living up there, miles from another soul? They say his cabin doesn't even have proper windows. I heard he barely speaks, just grunts like an animal. Clara had seen Jacob once before, 2 years ago during his last visit to town. He'd been loading supplies into his wagon, and she'd walked past on her way to the seamstress. He'd stepped aside to let her pass, and she'd noticed his eyes. They weren't mean or wild. They were just tired. Sad maybe. The kind of sadness that comes from being alone too long. That evening, Clara made a decision that terrified her. She walked to the edge of town where Jacob was preparing his wagon for the journey home. The sun was setting, painting everything orange and purple, and she could hear her heart pounding in her ears. This was insane. This was desperate. This was her only option. He saw her coming and straightened up. Up close, he was even bigger than she remembered. His shadow stretched long across the dirt road, and she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. For a moment, her courage failed her completely. What was she doing? She didn't know this man. Nobody knew this man, but then she thought about her sisters, about her stepmother's cold smile when she'd given Clara the ultimatum, about the bank officer who'd looked at their house like he was already planning what to do with it. "Mr. Thornwood," she said, and was grateful her voice didn't shake. "I heard you're looking for a wife." He didn't respond immediately, just studied her with those gray eyes that reminded her of storm clouds before rain. She forced herself to keep talking. "I need help. My father left debts, and if they're not paid, my family loses everything. My sisters are young. They'll have nowhere to go." She took a breath. "I'll marry you if you settle the debts. It's a business arrangement. I'll keep your house, cook your meals, do whatever work you need. I won't complain about the mountains or the isolation." The silence that followed felt like it lasted an hour. A dog barked somewhere in town. A wagon rolled past on the main street. Jacob's expression didn't change. He just looked at her like he was trying to see something beneath her words. Finally, he spoke. His voice was deeper than she expected, but surprisingly soft, like distant thunder rather than the harsh bark she'd imagined. How much? She told him the amount. It wasn't a fortune, but it wasn't small either. Enough to ruin a family, but maybe not enough to matter to a man who traded furs and lived on almost nothing. He nodded once. 3 days. We marry in 3 days. I'll have the money ready, that was it. No questions about what she liked or wanted. No attempt to know her at all. Just business exactly as she'd proposed. He pulled a piece of paper from his wagon and wrote out an agreement in surprisingly neat handwriting. He'd pay the debts. She'd come to the mountains. They'd be married legally and properly. Clara took the paper with numb fingers. She'd just agreed to marry a complete stranger. A man everyone in town feared and avoided. A man who lived so far from civilization that she might not see another woman for months at a time. She walked home in the dying light, the agreement clutched in her hand like a lifeline or a death sentence. She couldn't quite decide which. Her stepmother would be pleased. The debts would be paid. Her sisters would be safe. And Clara would disappear into the mountains with a man who spoke in single words and lived like a hermit. That night she packed her belongings. One small trunk was all she could take. She folded her mother's quilt, the one good dress she owned and the few books she'd managed to keep when they'd sold everything else. She looked around her small room and tried not to cry. This had been her home her whole life. In 3 days she'd leave it forever. The wedding was quick and quiet. The preacher looked uncomfortable the entire time, as if he thought he should stop this but didn't know how. Jacob wore clean clothes that looked stiff and unfamiliar on his large frame. He said his vows in that soft, deep voice, and Clara said hers with her hands shaking. When it was done, he handed the preacher an envelope with the money for her family's debts, and they walked to his wagon. Her stepmother hadn't even come to say goodbye. Her sisters had cried and clung to her, making her promise to visit, though they all knew the mountains were too far for casual visits. Clara climbed onto the wagon seat beside her new husband, and he clicked his tongue at the horses. As Timber Ridge disappeared behind them, Clara felt like she was being swallowed by the wilderness. The road got narrower and rougher. The trees grew taller and closer together. Jacob didn't speak, didn't look at her, just guided the horses with steady hands. She tried to imagine what her life would be like now. Tried to picture the cabin everyone said was barely livable. Tried not to think about how completely alone she'd be with a man she didn't know at all. She'd saved her sisters. That's what mattered. She'd done her duty to her family. If the price was her own happiness, well, she'd never expected much happiness anyway. At least in the mountains, there'd be no stepmother criticizing her every move. No townspeople whispering about her father's failures. The wagon jolted over a rough patch, and Jacob's arm shot out instinctively to steady her. He pulled it back immediately, as if touching her had burned him. Clara glanced at him, but his eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead. Whatever life awaited her in those mountains, she was committed now. For better or worse, she was the mountain man's wife. The journey took 6 hours, though it felt like days to Clara. The wagon climbed steadily upward on a path that barely deserved to be called a road. Sometimes it was just 2 wheel ruts through the pine needles. Other times it disappeared completely, and Jacob seemed to navigate by instinct alone. The trees grew so thick overhead that even midday felt like dusk. Clara gripped the edge of the wooden seat and tried not to think about how far they were from anything resembling civilization. Every mile took her further from the world she knew. The sounds changed too. Town noises faded away until all she could hear was wind through branches, bird calls she didn't recognize, and the steady clop of horse hooves on dirt and stone. Jacob spoke twice during the entire trip. The first time he pointed off to the left where Clara could barely make out shapes moving between trees. "Deer," he said simply. She counted 5 of them, watching the wagon pass with mild curiosity before going back to whatever deer do. The second time he warned her about a rough patch coming up. "Hold on," he said, and she barely had time to brace herself before the wagon bounced over roots and rocks that seemed determined to shake them apart. His voice surprised her both times. It wasn't rough or harsh like she'd expected. It was quiet, almost gentle. The kind of voice someone uses in a library or around something fragile. She wanted to say something back, to break the heavy silence, but couldn't think of anything that didn't sound stupid. "What do you say to a stranger you just married? How do you make conversation with someone who lives alone by choice? The cabin appeared suddenly, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. She'd been preparing herself for a rough shack with a dirt floor and maybe a hole in the roof. The women in town had painted such a clear picture of primitive conditions that she'd half expected to find Jacob living in a cave. This was nothing like that. The cabin stood solid and strong, built from logs that had been carefully fitted together. It had real glass windows, not just shutters. The roof looked new and well-maintained. There was even a small porch with a rocking chair and window boxes that must have held flowers during warmer months. Someone had put thought into this place. Care. Jacob climbed down from the wagon and offered his hand to help her down. His palm was rough with calluses, but his grip was careful, like he was afraid of holding too tight. He grabbed her trunk like it weighed nothing and headed for the door. Inside, Clara stopped so abruptly she nearly stumbled. The main room had a stone fireplace big enough for her to stand in without ducking. The furniture was handmade but skillfully done, everything smooth and sturdy. A table with 4 chairs sat near the kitchen area. A comfortable-looking sofa faced the fireplace, and along one entire wall, shelves full of books stretched from floor to ceiling. She walked closer to the books, drawn by pure shock. Shakespeare's complete works, Thoreau's writings, collections of poetry by authors she'd only heard about but never read. Books on nature, on philosophy, on history. There had to be over 100 volumes here, carefully arranged and obviously well read. You can read them, Jacob said from behind her, making her jump. Whenever you want. She turned to look at him, really look at him for the first time. He stood in the doorway with her trunk still in his arms, his expression uncertain. Was he worried she wouldn't like it? This man who barely spoke, who everyone feared, was nervous about whether his home met her approval. It's beautiful, she said honestly. I expected something much more rough. Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile, but close. Relief, maybe. He nodded toward a doorway on the right. Your room, her room, not their room. The distinction wasn't lost on her, and she felt an odd mixture of relief and something else she couldn't name. He carried her trunk into a bedroom that was bigger than the one she'd had at home. A real bed with a quilt in shades of blue and white. A dresser with a mirror. A window overlooking the trees. The quilt pattern was intricate, a wedding ring design that must have taken months to complete. Did you make this? She asked, touching the quilt. He shifted his weight, suddenly looking uncomfortable. My mother, before she passed, she hoped I'd find someone. Clara felt something tighten in her chest. His mother had made this quilt, hoping her son would marry someday, would have someone to share his life with. And now here Clara was, wearing the title of wife but feeling like an intruder in a space prepared with love and hope. Jacob left her to unpack, and she heard him moving around in other parts of the cabin. She opened her trunk and carefully placed her few belongings in the dresser. Her mother's quilt went on the bed next to his mother's. The book she'd brought went on a small shelf by the window. When everything was put away, the trunk looked sad and empty, a reminder of how little she'd brought to this new life. The next few days fell into a strange rhythm. Jacob woke before dawn. She'd hear him moving quietly through the cabin, starting the fire, putting coffee on to boil. By the time she got up, he'd already be outside working. He chopped wood with a steady rhythm that she could hear from inside. He checked his trap lines, though she learned quickly he didn't trap to kill. He used humane traps and checked them constantly to make sure nothing suffered. He had chickens that provided eggs and a small garden plot he'd prepared for spring planting. There was a well with a pump that brought up clear, cold water. A workshop behind the cabin where she could hear him sawing and hammering at various times of day. He worked constantly, but not in a frantic way. More like someone who found peace in keeping his hands busy. Clara tried to make herself useful. She cooked meals with the supplies he'd stocked and found he'd been thoughtful about what to buy. Real coffee, not the cheap substitute. Good flour. Dried herbs. She cleaned and organized. Though the cabin was already remarkably tidy for a bachelor's home, she discovered he did his own mending and did it well. His clothes were patched neatly, everything clean and cared for. They ate meals together in silence mostly, though it wasn't an angry silence. Just quiet. Sometimes he'd comment on the food, a simple "this is good" that seemed to cost him effort to say. She'd thank him and they'd go back to eating. After dinner, he'd usually retreat to his workshop or sit on the porch with a book while she cleaned up. On the third evening, Clara decided to explore the workshop. She'd been curious about what he did out there for hours at a time. The door wasn't locked. Inside, she found a space that was part carpenter's shop, part artist's studio. Tools hung neatly on the walls, everything in its place. But what caught her attention were the carvings, dozens of them in various stages of completion. Animals, mostly, carved from different types of wood. A bear that looked ready to walk off its shelf. A family of rabbits so detailed she could see individual whiskers. Birds with feathers so delicate they seemed like they might blow away. Each piece showed incredible patience and skill. Jacob stood at his workbench with his back to her, completely absorbed in carving something small. His huge hands moved with surprising delicacy, the knife making tiny, precise cuts. She must have made a sound because he turned around, and for a moment she thought he might be angry at the intrusion. Instead, he just looked at her, then at the carvings, then back to his work. After a pause, he held up what he'd been working on. A small bird, maybe a sparrow, captured mid-song. Every feather was visible, the beak open, the tiny feet gripping an invisible branch. "It's beautiful," Clara whispered, moving closer. "How did you learn to do this?" He shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "Books, practice, lots of failed attempts." He set the bird down gently. "Wood is patient. It doesn't judge." The words hung in the air between them, and Clara understood suddenly what he wasn't saying. Wood didn't judge, but people did. They'd judged him for his size, his silence, his choice to live alone. They'd never bothered to see past the surface to find out who he really was. She picked up one of the finished carvings, a fox with intelligent eyes and a bushy tail. "Do you sell these?" "Sometimes, when I go to town." He picked up his knife again, turning back to his work. "People pay well for them." Don't know why. Clara could have told him why. Each carving showed a deep understanding of the animal, like he'd spent hours watching them, learning their movements and personalities. They weren't just skillfully made. They had life in them, but she sensed he wouldn't believe her if she said it, so she just carefully placed the fox back on its shelf. Over the following days, Clara started noticing more things. The way Jacob left wildflowers on the kitchen table each morning, simple bouquets of whatever was blooming. The separate bathing room he'd built, complete with a copper tub and a system for heating water. The fact that he'd stocked the kitchen with things she liked without asking, somehow knowing from watching her shop that one time in town what she'd choose. His wildness that everyone in town whispered about was just self-sufficiency. He'd learned to do everything himself because he had no choice. And his silence wasn't threatening or mean. It was just who he was. A man who thought before he spoke, who didn't waste words, who found peace in quiet. She watched him with the animals and saw a gentleness that would have shocked the town gossips. He talked to the chickens while collecting eggs, thanking them in that soft voice. He'd leave out extra corn for the wild turkeys that wandered through the clearing. Once she saw him spend an hour freeing a young raccoon that had gotten its paw stuck in a gap between logs in the woodpile. He worked carefully, talking to the frightened animal the whole time until it was free and scampered away. That evening, they sat together on the porch as the sun set. Jacob had brought out 2 cups of coffee and handed her one without a word. They rocked in companionable silence, listening to the forest settle in for night. Clara found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years, maybe ever. There was no stepmother criticizing her posture, no neighbors judging her family's poverty, no pressure to be anything other than what she was. "Do you miss town?" Jacob asked suddenly, his voice barely above a murmur. Clara thought about it honestly. "No, not really. I miss my sisters, but not the town itself." He nodded slowly as if this confirmed something he'd been wondering. "Most people do. Miss it, I mean. The noise and the people. Is that why you came up here? To get away from people?" His hands tightened on his coffee cup. "My father was a hard man. Mean when he drank, and he drank most days. After he died, I built this place. Wanted somewhere that felt safe." He paused, seeming to struggle with whether to continue. "People in town, they decided I was dangerous because I'm big, because I didn't talk much. Easier to avoid them than try to change their minds." Clara felt something shift inside her chest. The mountain man everyone feared had just been a hurt boy who grew up and found a place where he could finally breathe. And she'd come here thinking she was the desperate one, the one making the sacrifice. But maybe Jacob had been just as desperate in his own way, lonely enough that his dying mother's wish had convinced him to risk letting someone into his carefully built sanctuary. "I don't think you're dangerous," she said quietly. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his storm-gray eyes made her breath catch. "Thank you," he whispered. "That means more than you know." Winter came early that year, and it came hard. Clara woke one morning to find the world transformed. Snow had fallen during the night, covering everything in a blanket so thick she could barely see the tree line from the cabin windows. Jacob was already up, standing on the porch and looking out at the white landscape with an expression she couldn't read. "Is it always like this?" she asked, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the cold seeping through the doorway. "This is early. And heavy." He didn't sound worried exactly, more thoughtful. "We'll be snowed in for months, maybe until March or April." The reality of that hit Clara like a physical blow. Months. Just the two of them, completely isolated from the rest of the world. No possibility of visitors or trips to town. No escape if things went wrong. She must have made some sound because Jacob turned to look at her. "You'll be safe," he said quietly. "I've got supplies for 2 winters just in case. Wood's all cut and stacked. If you need anything, tell me now while I can still get to the shed." She nodded, not trusting her voice. Safe. Yes, she believed she'd be physically safe with him. But months of isolation with essentially a stranger? That was a different kind of challenge. The first week was the hardest. The snow kept falling and the silence inside the cabin grew heavier with each passing day. They moved around each other carefully, like dancers who hadn't learned the steps yet. He'd reach for the coffee pot at the same moment she did, and they'd both pull back apologetically. She'd start to speak and he'd start to speak, and they'd both stop and gesture for the other to go first, but slowly, gradually, they found a rhythm. Clara learned that Jacob woke before dawn no matter what, and always made the coffee. He'd leave her cup on the table, already prepared the way she liked it, before heading out to check on the animals and clear snow from the paths. She started waking earlier to make breakfast and found he had a terrible sweet tooth. Her simple pancakes with a bit of maple syrup made him close his eyes in appreciation, like she'd served him a feast. The isolation forced conversations they might have avoided otherwise. When you only have one other person to talk to, eventually you run out of small talk. One evening, as they sat by the fire working on separate tasks, Clara asked him about the books. How had a man who lived alone in the mountains collected so many? Jacob set down the harness he'd been mending and looked at the shelves like he was seeing them for the first time. "My mother taught me to read when I was young. Before my father started getting really bad, she'd sneak me books, hide them where he wouldn't find them." His voice went distant. He thought reading was useless. Thought it made a man soft. He'd burn any book he found. "But you kept collecting them." "After he died, yes. Every time I went to town, I'd buy whatever books they had. Didn't matter what kind. I read them all. Sometimes 2 or 3 times." He picked up the harness again, his hands needing something to do. "Up here, books are company. Their voices when everything else is quiet." Clara understood that bone deep. "My mother loved to read too. She'd read to me every night before bed. After she died, my father sold most of her books to pay gambling debts. I only managed to save 3. They sat in silence for a while after that, but it was a different kind of silence. Shared rather than separate. 2 people who'd both lost things they loved and found comfort in the same place. As the weeks passed, Clara discovered more layers to the man she'd married. She learned that he'd taught himself to read animal tracks and could tell her stories about the creatures that passed through their clearing, based on nothing but prints in the snow. A fox hunting for mice, a deer looking for food, once a mountain lion passing through in the night. Though Jacob didn't tell her about that one until days later, not wanting to frighten her. She found out he could identify every bird by its call and knew which plants were good for medicine and which would make you sick. He'd learned it all from books and careful observation, building a kind of education that no school could have given him. When she asked why he knew so much about healing herbs, he'd shrugged and said simply, "Can't get a doctor up here in winter. Had to learn to take care of myself." One particularly cold afternoon, Clara was reading by the fire when she heard a thud from outside, followed by Jacob's voice speaking in low, urgent tones. She looked out the window and saw him kneeling in the snow, his coat off despite the freezing temperature, wrapped around something she couldn't see. She grabbed her shawl and went out to find him cradling a hawk, its wing bent at an unnatural angle. The bird was trying to fight him, weak claws scraping at his arms, but he just held it gently and kept talking in that soft voice she'd only heard him use with animals. "Easy now. Easy. I'm trying to help. I know it hurts. I know you're scared. What happened? Clara asked, keeping her voice quiet so as not to startle the bird further. Hit a tree branch, I think. Wings broken. He looked up at her and she saw genuine distress in his eyes. I can set it. I've done it before, but I need help holding him still. They worked together in the workshop, Clara holding the hawk wrapped in Jacob's coat while he carefully examined the wing. His huge hands moved with incredible delicacy, feeling along the bone, checking for other injuries. The bird struggled at first, but something about Jacob's voice, the steady calm of it, seemed to help. When he set the wing and splinted it with carefully shaped pieces of willow, the hawk barely flinched. He built a cage for the bird, padded with soft cloth, and put it in a quiet corner of the cabin. For the next 3 weeks, Jacob tended that hawk like it was made of glass. He fed it by hand, changed its water, checked the splint daily. Clara would wake in the night and hear him talking to it, telling it stories about the mountains, about flying, about freedom. Will it be able to fly again? She asked one evening as they watched the hawk eat. Should be able to. Might not be quite as strong, but it'll fly. He paused. Won't keep it any longer than needed, though. Being caged, even when it's for your own good, that's a kind of death for a wild thing. The way he said it made Clara wonder if he was still talking about the bird. How many times had people tried to cage him with their expectations and fears? How many times had he been told he should be different, smaller, quieter, more normal? Another evening, Clara found him in his workshop, but he wasn't carving. He was reading, and as she got closer, she realized his eyes were wet with tears. The book was poetry, and he was crying over words on a page. When he noticed her, he didn't try to hide it or act embarrassed. He just wiped his eyes and showed her the poem. Wordsworth, he said simply. He understood. About nature. About finding peace in simple things. She sat down next to him and he began to read aloud, his voice, usually so quiet and economical, transformed when reading poetry. He gave each word its proper weight, let the rhythm flow naturally. He read like someone who'd spent hours with these words, had memorized them not through effort but through love. When he finished, Clara realized she was crying too. That was beautiful. Where did you learn to read like that? He looked almost shy. Just practice. Nobody to hear me up here, so I'd read out loud to the trees. Probably sounded foolish. No, she said firmly. Not foolish at all. You should read more often. You have a gift for it. After that, reading aloud became part of their evening routine. They'd take turns passing the book back and forth. Sometimes poetry, sometimes stories, sometimes just interesting passages from books about history or nature. Clara found herself looking forward to these evenings, to the sound of his voice wrapping around words, to the way he'd pause and look at her when a passage was particularly meaningful. They started sharing more stories about their lives. Clara told him about her sisters, about the games they'd play and the dreams they'd had before their father died. Jacob told her about his mother, how she'd protected him as best she could, how she'd saved her pennies to buy him books and then hidden them in the flour sack where his father never looked. She would have liked you, he said one night. You're gentle, kind, that's all she ever wanted for me. Someone kind. The word settled into Clara's heart and stayed there. She'd never thought of herself as particularly kind. Just ordinary. But maybe ordinary kindness was rarer than she'd realized. One morning in late January, Jacob came in from his chores looking troubled. Clara was kneading bread dough and she stopped when she saw his expression. What's wrong? He held up a trap, one of his humane ones. Someone's been messing with my trap lines. This was Resu. It wrong. Dangerous. Could really hurt something instead of just holding it. Who would do that? Don't know. Could be hunters from the valley. Could be someone who doesn't like me. He set the trap down carefully. I'll have to check all of them. Make sure they're safe. He spent the entire day out in the cold, checking every trap, making sure nothing could get hurt. When he came back, his hands were nearly frozen despite his gloves, and his face was grim. 3 more were tampered with. Someone's doing this on purpose. He warmed his hands by the fire. I don't want you going out alone. Not until I figure out who's out there. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter. She'd felt so safe up here, isolated but protected. The idea that someone might be out there watching, waiting, made her see the mountain differently. That night they sat by the fire and Jacob sang. She hadn't known he could sing. His voice was deep and rich, carrying old hymns his mother had taught him. Songs about grace and redemption and finding peace. Clara closed her eyes and let the music wash over her. and felt safe again despite the unknown threat outside. When he finished, she opened her eyes to find him looking at her. Really looking like he was trying to memorize her face. "I'm glad you're here," he said quietly. "I know this wasn't what you wanted. I know you came out of desperation. But I'm glad anyway. This place has been lonely for a long time." Clara's throat tightened. "I'm glad too. And Jacob, it's not just desperation anymore. I want you to know that." Something shifted in his expression. Hope, maybe. Or the beginning of it. He reached across the space between their chairs and offered his hand, palm up. An invitation, not a demand. Clara took it, and his rough fingers closed gently around hers. They sat like that until the fire burned low, hands linked, neither of them quite brave enough to say what they were both starting to feel, that this marriage of convenience was becoming something real, that somewhere between the poetry readings and the rescued hawks and the quiet mornings they'd started to care. Outside, snow began to fall again, but inside the cabin, something warmer than any fire was finally starting to bloom. Spring came late to the mountains, but when it arrived, it transformed everything. The snow melted in rushing streams down the hillsides. Birds returned with songs Clara had never heard before. The meadow around the cabin exploded with wildflowers in colors so bright they almost hurt to look at. Jacob released the hawk they'd nursed back to health, and they watched together as it circled once overhead before flying off toward freedom. Clara stood on the porch that morning, breathing in air that smelled like pine and wet earth and new beginnings. She'd been on this mountain for nearly 6 months now, and it had stopped feeling like exile. Somewhere along the way, without her quite noticing when, it had become home. Jacob was in the garden preparing the soil for planting. She watched him work, his movements efficient and practiced. They'd grown comfortable with each other over the long winter. Not just comfortable, if she was honest with herself. She'd catch herself looking forward to his return from the trap lines. She'd find excuses to sit near him in the evenings. Once she'd fallen asleep against his shoulder while he read aloud, and when she woke he hadn't moved, had just sat there holding the book with one hand, being careful not to disturb her. She was falling in love with him. The realization had crept up on her gradually, undeniable now in the spring sunshine. This gentle man who sang to injured birds and cried over poetry, and had built a life based on peace rather than the violence he'd grown up with. She loved him, and had no idea if he felt anything similar, or if she was still just the wife he'd agreed to take out of obligation to his mother's dying wish. The sound of horses approaching broke through her thoughts. Jacob straightened immediately, his whole body going tense. Visitors were rare, especially this early in spring when the roads were barely passable. Clara came down from the porch and stood beside him as a wagon emerged from the trees. Her stomach dropped when she recognized the driver. Her stepmother, sitting rigid in her best dress despite the mud-splattered journey, and next to her Sheriff Morrison from Timber Ridge, looking uncomfortable but determined. Jacob moved slightly in front of Clara, not threateningly, but protectively. "Can I help you folks?" The sheriff climbed down from the wagon, his boots sinking into the soft ground. "Sorry to intrude, Thornwood, but there's been a legal matter brought to my attention. Regarding your marriage," Clara's stepmother finally spoke, her voice sharp with triumph. "The marriage can be annulled. My lawyer found a precedent. When a marriage is contracted under financial duress, it can be legally dissolved. Clara was forced into this arrangement to pay debts. That makes it invalid." "I wasn't forced," Clara said, finding her voice. "I agreed willingly. You agreed because you had no choice. That's the very definition of duress." Her stepmother's smile was cold. "I've already arranged a proper marriage for you. Mr. Whitfield from Denver needs a wife. He's wealthy, established, and he's willing to pay handsomely for a young bride. You'll come back to town today and we'll make the arrangements." Clara felt Jacob go completely still beside her. She knew that stillness now. It was how he got when he was feeling too much and didn't know how to express it. He was preparing to let her go. To step aside and let her leave because he'd never keep anyone against their will, because that's who he was. The sheriff cleared his throat awkwardly. "Look, Mrs. Thornwood, nobody's forcing anything, but the law's complicated here. If you were under financial pressure when you agreed to the marriage, there's grounds for annulment. You'd be free to make a different choice." "I already made my choice," Clara said, her voice stronger now. She'd spent 6 months finding herself on this mountain, finding peace and safety in something that felt startlingly close to happiness. She wasn't going to let her stepmother's greed take that away. "I chose to marry Jacob. I chose to stay here. And I'm choosing to stay now. Her stepmother's face flushed with anger. Don't be stupid, girl. Look at this place. Look at him. You're wasting your life up here in the wilderness with a man who barely speaks. Mr. Whitfield can give you everything. A proper house in the city, society, servants, everything a woman should want. I don't want those things. Clara was surprised by how true it was. 6 months ago, maybe she would have been tempted, but that felt like a different lifetime. I have everything I want right here. You have nothing but isolation and poverty. You're living like a savage. Her stepmother gestured dismissively at the cabin, at Jacob, at everything Clara had come to love. This isn't a real life. This isn't a real marriage. You're playing house in the woods, and I won't stand by and watch you throw away a chance at a proper future. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, if Clara says she wants to stay, I'm not sure there's much I can do. The annulment requires her agreement. She doesn't know what she wants. She's been isolated up here, hasn't had contact with normal people. She's not thinking clearly. The stepmother turned to Jacob, contempt clear on her face. Tell her you'll sign the papers. You can't possibly want to keep her here against the possibility of a better life. Jacob had been silent through all of this, but now he spoke. His voice was quiet, but there was steel underneath. I'd never keep Clara anywhere she didn't want to be. But I won't speak for her either. She's got her own mind and her own voice. If she wants to go, I'll sign whatever papers need signing. If she wants to stay, then she stays. That's all there is to it. This is ridiculous. The stepmother climbed down from the wagon, her expensive boots sinking into the mud. Clara, be reasonable. This mountain man can't give you anything. He lives like an animal up here. You deserve better than a husband who probably can't even write his own name. He can write, Clara said, anger finally heating her words. He can write beautifully. He reads Shakespeare and Wordsworth. He built this cabin with his own hands. He's gentle and kind, and he's never once raised his voice to me or made me feel small, which is more than I can say for the men you approved of back in town. Gentle? Kind? Her stepmother laughed harshly. He's a recluse who hides in the mountains because he can't function in civilized society. You're fooling yourself if you think this is anything but a prison. Clara felt something snap inside her. All the fear and anxiety she'd carried for years, all the times she'd let herself be pushed around and told what to think and feel, crystallized into pure clarity. She took a step forward, putting herself between her stepmother and Jacob. This isn't a prison. It's the first place I've ever felt free. The first place where I could be myself without being criticized or judged or told I wasn't good enough. Jacob sees me. He values me. He treats me with kindness every single day. You want to talk about real marriage? This is more real than anything I would have found in your world of contracts and arrangements and using people like property. She reached back and found Jacob's hand, pulling it forward so their joined hands were visible. I love him. I love this life. And I'm not leaving. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara felt Jacob's hand tighten around hers, felt a tremor run through him. She couldn't look at him yet, couldn't see his reaction, because if she saw doubt or pity or obligation in his eyes, it would break something inside her. You love him? Her stepmother's voice dripped with disbelief and disgust. You've lost your mind. You're throwing away everything for a fantasy. No. Clara finally turned to look at Jacob, her heart pounding. His eyes were wide, storm gray, and full of something that looked like wonder. I'm choosing something real for the first time in my life. The sheriff coughed awkwardly. Well then, seems like this matter is settled. Marriage was legal, payment was made, and the lady wants to stay. Don't see what else there is to say. This isn't over, her stepmother hissed, climbing back into the wagon. You'll regret this, Clara. When you're old and used up from this hard life, don't come crying to me. I won't regret it, and I won't be coming back. Clara squeezed Jacob's hand. This is my home now. They watched the wagon disappear back down the mountain, neither of them moving until the sound of horses faded completely. Then Jacob turned to her and she saw tears streaming down his face. You meant it? His voice broke on the words. You love me? Yes. Clara's own tears started falling. I tried not to. I thought this was just an arrangement. But you're the kindest person I've ever known. How could I not love you? He pulled her into his arms and she felt his whole body shaking. I've loved you since the 2nd month, he whispered into her hair. When you laughed at my terrible joke about the chickens, I thought I was imagining you might care back. Thought it was just wishful thinking. Clara pulled back enough to see his face. Why didn't you say anything? Didn't want to pressure you. Didn't want you to feel trapped. You agreed to a business arrangement, and I figured that's all you wanted. All someone like you could want from someone like me. Someone like you." She reached up to touch his face, rough with beard but beloved. "You mean someone who saves injured birds and reads poetry and makes me feel safe? Someone who treats everything living with gentleness? Someone who built a sanctuary in the mountains because the world was too harsh? Someone big and awkward who doesn't know how to talk to people?" He tried to smile, but it wavered. "Someone everyone's afraid of. I'm not afraid of you. I never was, really, and you're not awkward. You're just quiet. There's a difference." She stood on her toes and kissed him, soft and brief but full of meaning. "You're the best man I've ever known, Jacob Thornwood." He kissed her back then, deeper, like he was drowning and she was air. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I'll spend every day trying to deserve you. You already do." She laughed, giddy with relief and joy and the pure freedom of having finally said the truth out loud. "We deserve each other. Two people who were told they weren't enough, finding out together that we're exactly right." They stood there in the spring sunshine holding each other, while the mountains sang around them with birdsong and rushing streams and the sound of things growing. The hawk they'd healed circled overhead, its cry echoing across the valley. That night, Clara moved her things into Jacob's room. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Because this wasn't a business arrangement anymore. It was love, messy and real and chosen freely by both of them. As she fell asleep in his arms for the first time, listening to his heartbeat steady under her ear, she thought about the girl she'd been 6 months ago. Desperate and afraid and certain her life was ending. She'd been wrong. Her life hadn't ended on this mountain. It had finally truly begun. News traveled slowly in the mountains, but it traveled. By summer, word of Clara's defiance had spread through Timber Ridge like wildfire. The story grew and changed with each telling, the way stories do, but the core remained the same. The mountain man's wife had chosen him over wealth and society. She'd stood in front of everyone and declared her love for the man the whole town had feared. People didn't quite know what to make of it. Some said Clara must be simple-minded or under some kind of spell. Others whispered that maybe they'd been wrong about Jacob Thornwood. Maybe there was more to him than his silence and sighs. The debate raged in the general store, at church socials, over fence lines between neighbors. When July came and Jacob needed to make his trading trip, Clara insisted on going with him. She'd been on the mountain for nearly a year now, and while she didn't miss town life, she did miss her sisters. She wanted them to see that she was happy, that she'd made the right choice. The wagon ride down felt different this time. Clara sat close to Jacob, their shoulders touching, and they talked easily about nothing and everything. He told her about the Fox family he'd spotted near the North Trap Line. She told him about the book she was reading, a novel about adventure at sea. They'd grown so comfortable with each other that silence was just as natural as conversation. Timber Ridge looked the same as Clara remembered, but she felt completely different. She climbed down from the wagon with her head high, wearing a simple dress she'd made herself and a smile she couldn't have faked if she tried. Let them stare. Let them whisper. She knew who she was now, and she knew the value of what she'd found. Jacob tied the horses, and immediately several people found reasons to be nearby. The blacksmith's wife, who'd been so vocal about never marrying the mountain man, now watched with open curiosity. The shopkeeper's daughter stared like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Even old Mr. Henderson, who'd always given Jacob a wide berth, nodded cautiously in greeting. "I need to check on my sisters," Clara told Jacob. "Will you be all right?" He smiled, and it still surprised her sometimes how that smile transformed his whole face. "I'll be fine. Take your time. I've got business with the trader anyway." Clara walked through town toward her old house, aware of eyes following her. She didn't care. She had nothing to prove to these people. Nothing to explain. She was here for her sisters, and that was all that mattered. The house looked smaller than she remembered, more worn. Her stepmother answered the door with barely concealed irritation. "So you came back?" "Just to visit my sisters." The girls came running before her stepmother could respond, squealing and wrapping their arms around Clara. They'd grown in a year, gotten taller and older looking. They pulled her inside, talking over each other, desperate to tell her everything that had happened. Her stepmother disappeared into another room with a disapproving sniff. Clara sat with her sisters and listened to their stories about school and friends and the small dramas of town life. They asked her 100 questions about the mountains, about Jacob, about her life. "Is he mean to you?" the younger one asked, her eyes wide with worry. "No, sweetie. He's never been mean. He's the kindest person I know. But everyone says he's scary." Clara thought about how to explain it. People are scared of what they don't understand. Jacob is quiet and he lives differently than most people, but that doesn't make him scary. It just makes him different. The older sister studied Clara's face. "You look happy. Really happy. Not like before." "I am happy. Then I'm glad." She squeezed Clara's hand. "I'm glad you found something good, even if it meant leaving us." Clara spent 2 hours with her sisters before her stepmother made it clear the visit was over. She hugged the girls tight and promised to visit again when Jacob came to town. As she left, she felt lighter somehow. They were all right. They'd be fine, and knowing that freed her from the last thread of guilt she'd been carrying. She found Jacob outside the general store, surrounded by a small crowd. Her heart jumped into her throat until she realized they weren't threatening him. They were looking at his carvings. He'd spread them out on a cloth and people were examining them with genuine interest. Mrs. Henderson held a carved rabbit, turning it over in her hands. "This is remarkable. The detail is extraordinary." "How much?" someone else asked, pointing at a bear cub. Jacob named his prices, and Clara noticed they were too low. These carvings were art worth far more than he was asking. But he seemed uncomfortable with even that much attention, his shoulders tense, his words few. Clara moved through the crowd and stood beside him. Just her presence seemed to help him relax a fraction. Together they sold half his carvings in an hour. People who'd never spoken to Jacob before suddenly had questions about his work, about his techniques, about whether he took custom orders. The doctor's wife approached last, a kind-looking woman in her 50s. "Mr. Thornwood, my husband and I would like to invite you and your wife to dinner. Would tomorrow evening work? We live just outside town and the trip wouldn't be too difficult." Jacob looked at Clara, uncertainty clear in his eyes. She smiled and nodded. "We'd be honored. Thank you." That evening they stayed at the boarding house, the first time they'd spent a night apart from their mountain home. Clara lay in the narrow bed and thought about how strange it was to hear so many sounds. Voices from other rooms. Wagons on the street. Dogs barking. The mountain was never truly silent, but it was peaceful quiet. "This was just noise. You awake?" Jacob's voice came from the other bed. They'd paid for 2 rooms to maintain propriety, but had left the connecting door open. "Yes. Too loud to sleep." She heard him get up, saw his shadow in the doorway. "Can I?" He gestured to the space beside her on the bed. Clara scooted over in answer. He lay down carefully like he was afraid of taking up too much space, and she immediately curled into his side. This was better. His heartbeat was familiar. His warmth blocked out the strangeness of town.